Good evening all, and welcome. I hope you're ready for the embrace of the bitter cold, because it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. We lived on a farm in a wildland island, way out in the middle of nowhere, just outside of Ballymahon, in Westmeath. As the story goes, a man used to come home every night to the house he lived in with his mother. He'd come down the road, come to the back door, go to the hall in the kitchen, and then pull up a chair and sit in the table and have something to eat before going to bed. From her bed, his mother heard him repeat the exact same pattern every night. The last night though, she heard the door and the steps and the sliding chair in the kitchen as usual, and went to bed, and fell happily asleep knowing her son was home. Only that morning, when she woke up, her son wasn't in the house. When she went outside to look for him, they found him hanging from a tree beside the gate to the field. He would have crossed as a shortcut the last stretch of the road to get home. The gate was left open, by the way, which doesn't make sense because we all kept cattle in that field and they would have gotten out easily. The implication was that he never physically made it home that night, but his spirit did. My grandparents moved into that house and my mother grew up there. My granny claims she heard the ghost herself a few times, but what really gets everyone upset is that when you leave our farm, you have to walk down that lonely road and go right past the gate, and many a time it just would be wide open, and there would be no way anybody in their right mind would forget to close it behind them, because the cattle would inadvertently get loose. Believe me, when you're a little kid and have heard that story a few times, and having to walk down that road alone to go make sure the cattle didn't wander off, you don't walk past that gate. You run like hell past it. To this day, some 50 years later, the gate is still there, and so is the tree that the man hung himself from. It's an ugly old looking thing, the perfect hanging tree, and I still get the creeps every time I go back there and go past it. I never linger there, and every once in a while the cattle do still get out and block the road, so we have to go and herd them back in. But I never told any of the kids this story that might explain how they got out in the first place. I figured I'd share with you some strange and what I believe to be paranormal experiences happening at my place of employment. I work at an old restaurant in a city in Oregon. I will not say which restaurant for obvious reasons. I work as the bread baker during the night hours. My shift is usually from 8:30 p.m. till around 3 a.m, depending on which products need to be made. My co-workers tend to leave at 10 o'clock. Sometimes the dishwasher is there a little later, though I got lucky moving here and landing this job right away at $13 an hour. But now, I don't feel so lucky. My first experience was the second month of working here. I had just put some hamburger buns in the proofer and had some time to kill, so I walked into the dining area and made myself some espresso. Halfway there, I noticed a faint whistling coming from the dining area. I shrugged it off, as it stopped once I entered. As soon as the espresso was done, the whistling started again, but louder. I couldn't make out if it was a song or not. But it went on for about a minute and then stopped. My whole body shivered, as I was definitely creeped out. The next day I mentioned this to the dishwasher, and she looked at me for a minute and then sighed. She told me the building was most definitely haunted, and that she constantly hears the whistling as well, but only when she's by herself. Sadly, the conversation ended there, as she doesn't speak English all that well. Fast forward a few weeks later, This experience freaked me out quite badly for a few days. I still get chills thinking about it. You may not think it's creepy, but it was. They have a huge walk-in cooler filled with tons of prepped food, and so on. This was about 11 PM, and the dishwasher was still there. I walked into the cooler to grab some butter. The door is huge and heavy, and there is no way wind could shut the door, especially because there was no wind to shut it. As I was reaching for the butter, I hear the door slam behind me. I was obviously startled and thought maybe the dishwasher closed it, thinking I left it open by accident. I walked to the door and started yelling for her, hoping she would hear me, and after about 3 minutes, no response. I panicked. It was super cold in there, and I kept banging on the door and yelling. And about 10 minutes later, she finally heard me and opened it, looking confused. Shivering, I asked her if she closed the door on me, and she said no. I told her that the door closed on me, and the look on her face freaked me out. I texted my boss and told him what happened, and asked him to check the security cameras. When he answered, he told me he watched, and said that he saw me walk in, and about 10 seconds later, the door slammed shut. No one was behind it. It just shut by itself. That never happened to anyone else. We were both confused, and I was weary. A few weeks after, in the dining room, they mopped the floors after every night. I noticed that they were in their usual spot on the tables, and I didn't think much of it. As I was making bread dough at about 12 AM, something happened that I can't explain. In a span of almost 5 to 10 seconds, I heard the loudest crash coming from the dining area that shook the whole building, and the lights went out quickly and came back on. My heart was beating so fast and I felt nauseous. I had no idea what happened. I ran into the dining room and my heart sank from fear. All of the chairs were on the floor, scattered, and a few definitely broken, and then the whistling began. I immediately called my boss, and he rushed over. We went to the office and watched the security cameras. The video showed the chairs on the top of the tables, and then the lights went out. They came back on, and the chairs were scattered all over the floor. The look on his face filled my body with dread. He promised to stay with me for the rest of the night, and I told him I was becoming scared of working by myself. He said I would be fine. This happened a few days ago, and it took everything in me not to quit this job. This was probably the scariest thing I've ever experienced. It was around 2:30 AM. The baguettes were in the oven, and it was almost time for me to leave. I had to use the restroom, so I walked into the dining room to get to the restroom. I heard the whistling, but very faint. It was becoming normal, and since nothing had happened for a while, I wasn't creeped out. I got to the restroom, locked the door, and sat down to do my business. About 10 seconds in, I hear a faint whisper come from outside the door. I chalked it up to just hearing things, and then I heard someone knock very lightly. My heart stopped. I was alone, or so I thought. I sat there in silence. Another light knock. I very quietly finished my business and pulled myself together. I stood somewhat closer to the door to try and hear what was outside the door. Another knock, and then I heard a faint whisper say, "Hello?" I almost screamed and almost pissed my pants, even though I had already peed. I kept quiet, in fear. Maybe this wasn't a ghost, but a junkie or creeper who managed to slip inside somehow. It knocked again, louder this time. The voice whispered, "I know you're in there." It sounded like a man's voice, but I couldn't tell, and it began to jiggle the door handle. And that is when I flipped out. I screamed, "Leave me alone!" The handle jiggled more violently and then stopped abruptly. I stood there in fear. After about a minute, it slammed the door so hard, I was surprised it didn't fling open. My heart was racing, and tears were streaming down my cheeks. Everything went silent for a good 20 seconds, and there was another loud bang that shook the whole restaurant. The door swung open so violently, and there was no one there. I ran out of there so fast, screaming and crying. The chairs were flung about, tables overturned, coffee cups shattered on the ground. I ran into the kitchen and grabbed my things, shut the ovens off. Hell, I didn't care if the baguettes were done or not, and ran out of the building and into my car. I called my boss, sobbing and hyperventilating, and he told me to wait in my car. He arrived about 5 minutes after, his car flying into the parking lot. I got out, but told him I would not be going back in there. He went inside and came out about 10 minutes after, looking wary and upset. He told me he watched the security footage and couldn't believe what he saw. As soon as I'd closed the bathroom door, he saw a sort of dark cloud-like figure float in front of the door. Right before the bang, the camera went to static for a few seconds to show the whole dining room a mess. Then the camera showed me running out of the bathroom. It's only been a few days since that happened, and I'm still shaken by it. My boss gave me the week off, paid. I still need to think it through though. Is it actually worth working in constant fear? Back in college, my friends and I got into the habit of exploring abandoned buildings. We've seen some incredible places and have gotten some pretty cool souvenirs. I don't really condone taking stuff from some buildings, but if it's about to be torn down and contractors have taken out everything they deem worth something, then I'd gladly take that depression glass they left behind. But I digress. It's a small group of friends that goes exploring with me, and I love introducing new people to it. A friend of mine had asked me on several occasions if I could take him somewhere, because he never went exploring before. I decided to take him to an old paper factory that didn't have much inside, but had an absolutely beautiful view of the city from the roof. Also, it was incredibly easy to get in and out of. We went with a few other people, but two of my friends had decided to wait outside for us, since they had been in the building a few too many times and didn't find it interesting anymore. As we went in to climb inside, a drunk couple came out, which is not unusual. A lot of people use the building to smoke and drink, and we asked if there were many people inside. They said they thought it was mostly empty, but they heard someone banging around a few floors up, and it had startled them. They said he sounded angry, and that maybe we should avoid the roof. Since we weren't there to drink or anything, the roof was our only goal, so we decided to take our chances and head up. After all, it's a massive building, and we didn't think that we would run into the guy. We walk up 10 flights of stairs and climb the ladder to the roof, and my friend is very impressed with the awesome view. As we were about to head back down, my friend waiting on the street calls us. He says that a man has passed out in the street, and the two of them pulled him out of the way of traffic and called an ambulance. They suggested that we wait on the roof to avoid exiting the building while the cops are there. Neither of us can afford the $5,000 fine or 2 weeks in jail for looking at the city from an abandoned building. We wait, but we probably shouldn't have waited on the roof. We get the all clear from my friend to come back down, and we head to the ladder. My friend goes first, and then our flashlight dies. The ladder is tricky to get onto, especially when you can't see as it's missing some rungs, so I come down very slowly in the dark, afraid of hurting myself. I hop down, and my friend tells me very quietly that he hears someone in the room next to us. I shrug it off. We already know people are in the building. Then the screaming starts. At first, it almost sounds like one of my friends who waited outside is yelling my name. I hesitate at the top of the stairs, just outside the door of the room the screaming is coming from, trying to decide if it's him, and he's playing some sort of prank. The guy I came into the building with grabs my wrists, and we start running down the stairs at this point. It's obvious it's not my friend, and it's just guttural intense screaming. We start running down the stairs and then hear a really loud banging to go with the screaming. It sounds like this guy has a very heavy set of objects that he's swinging at the walls and exposed pipes with. There is only one flight of stairs because every other way down is out of order freight elevators. So we are trapped in this stairwell, and it's 10 flights until we reach the ground floor. So we have to book it to the opposite side of the factory and back out the hole we climbed through. Besides screaming and swinging that heavy object, we hear him barreling down the stairs behind us. But he is at least 1 floor behind. Whatever he is using to hit the walls and pipes with is clearly enough to do some sort of damage to our skulls, because a bit of brick chipped off the walls and followed us down the steps, and that's when my friend grabs my wrists again and throws me through the nearest door. We've only made it 3 floors down, and at the beginning of each flight of steps, there is only one door that opens onto the entire level. In other words, it's painfully obvious where we've gone. After flying into this room, we notice it's been gutted like every other floor, but more of the windows are boarded up and it's very dark. All that's in this room to hide behind us and pillars. We get behind one and huddle together. This guy stops outside the doorway in the room that we're in, and he's still screaming. It's terrifying, and he starts swinging his weapon around and slashing into the doorframe. We're sure he's going to come in, and the only way out is the door he's currently standing in. Neither of us look around the pillar to see the guy, and we have no idea what his weapon is. Nearly 4 minutes pass, and he hasn't stopped screaming. For whatever reason, he doesn't come into the room we're in, but starts running down the stairs. We can hear him hitting pipes and smacking the walls, and we just wait. We have 7 floors to go down, and we could still pass him at any doorway on the way down. Eventually the screaming and the banging stops, and we still think we should wait. But that's when we hear something from a different corner of our room. There is just enough light from a window in the back that hasn't been boarded up that we see a figure get up off the floor. This person has been in the room the entire time. This person is in front of the only light source, so we see a totally black figure that is now shuffling towards us without making a sound. It is exactly like a zombie movie, and we run. We don't bother to find out what this person's deal is, and temporarily forget about the first clearly dangerous guy. For an asthmatic, I hauled ass down the stairs and never paused to catch my breath once. As we are reaching the bottom of the stairwell, the screaming starts again. It's coming from the room next to us, but we don't stop running. The hole in the wall that we climbed through to get to the building is yards away, and this man comes crashing out of the room behind us. We never look back and climb through the hole so fast I don't even remember doing it. Our 2 friends are waiting for us, and we throw ourselves into the car. They ask what's happened, because apparently that man was so loud that they could hear him screaming and breaking things from outside the building. They thought we were making all the noises, and were going to give it a few minutes before calling us to remind us that the police were still patrolling the area for drunk, underage college students, and that we should probably be quiet. We tell them what happened, and decide to carry on with our plans for the night, because a beer was totally necessary after all of that. A young couple in the village had built a house close to a known fairy tree. In Irish folklore, fairy trees are surrounded by superstition, and people tend to avoid going near them, touching them, and definitely don't cut them down. When this couple built their house, They damaged part of the tree, but didn't kill it. Plenty of people mentioned it to them, including neighbors, but they shrugged it off as a whole lot of nonsense. Not long after moving into the house, they reported seeing someone watching the house. If they tried to go outside and confront the person, they would be gone by the time they got out. They put it down to children playing a trick on them, and out of the blue one day, it stopped. A year or two later, the couple had a baby boy. When the child was a few months old, the couple decided to have their first night out together, so they hired a local girl as the babysitter. Once she got there, everything was fine, and the couple went out to a pub in the nearest town to listen to some live music. A while after the couple left the baby, it started to cry. The babysitter would settle it, put it back in the cot, and go back to watching TV. At some point, the cry started to get louder, and the baby took longer to settle. The babysitter began feeling anxious, but there was nothing she could do, and didn't have a phone in the house, as she didn't know the number of the pub. At one point, the baby started crying extremely loudly. It was unnatural. The babysitter entered the room and went to the cot, and when she looked down, the baby was crying, but it has what she described as the face of an old man. She jumped back in fright, and in the corner of the room, spied someone standing there. They were no taller than a child, but it scared the hell out of her. In a panic, she ran out of the room and out of the house. She ran to the neighbor's house and told them what she'd seen. They came back with her to the house, afraid whoever was in the room would take the baby. When they got there, the baby was crying, and even the neighbors felt something uneasy in the air. One of them went back to the house and called the priest, because back in those days in Ireland, the priest was the person you called in a crisis. He came immediately and performed a blessing on the house and child. After that, everyone was at ease and the house felt calm again, apart from the babysitter who wanted nothing more than to go home. When the couple arrived home, they were frightened to see so many people in the house. The priest explained the situation, but gave little advice. The neighbors told them it was the fairies, and that they needed appeasing for the damage done to the tree. From then on, the couple left out some tokens for the fairies, food, drinks, coins, and were not bothered anymore. In the early 90s, I worked as a sous chef at the Hotel Colorado in Glenwood Springs. The employees went to great lengths to tell me all the juicy ghost stories associated with the place. Forbidden rooms, labyrinth basements, hauntings, etc. I never really paid it any mind. But towards the end of my tenure there, two very specific incidences led me to seek employment elsewhere. The kitchen in this place was built in the late 18th century, so think big, very tall ceilings, and damn near ancient fittings and equipment. The first incident happened late at night on what we used to call the bar line. It was a small kitchen off the main kitchen gallery. They had a late party in the bar, and I was finishing up a long day's shift. I had made an etouffee for the party that night, and had to clean a big arse old pot. I had already finished everything else cleanup-wise, so all I had left was to dry and hang said big arse old pot. The bar line had an overhead pot hangy thingy, with giant hooks to hold the pots by the handles. These hooks were 4 to 5 inches deep, and could have been used to hang beef. I dried the pot, and slipped it on the hook, and made my way around the corner to the break room to clock out and grab my shit. I am the only one left in the kitchen, so I would go through and start to turn off all the lights, and made my way back to the delivery door. As I laid my hand on the doorknob, a tremendous clangor shot through the whole kitchen. It sounded like a cannonball had gone off and made me jump about 3.5 feet off the ground. My heart is racing and my mind is going a mile a minute. I immediately turn all the lights back on and give out the old, "Is anyone there?" No one was. I grabbed the biggest butcher knife we had, affectionately named Old Choppy, and started to slowly ninja my way through the gallery, seeking out whatever the hell made that sound. After a brief but thorough search, I determined that it must have come from the bar line. Great. Nothing like a blind corner and creepy-ass activity to make a man feel special. I slowly, and I mean slowly, made my way around the corner, with the ever-faithful Choppy guiding the way. Lo and behold, the part I had hung up was laying prostrate on the ground. I looked up at the hook, and all is well. How the hell did that thing jump off a 5-inch hook? I was really disturbed by this. I picked up the pot and hung it on the hook on the opposite side of the pot hanger, and quickly made my way out of there. And here's the kicker. As I locked the door from the outside, boom! The sound of a pot hitting the ground, but muffled through the locked door, rings across the dark and empty parking lot. Like any smart man, I immediately noped out of there and went home. It wasn't until I got to bed that I realized that I had the breakfast shift the next day. The next morning, I got in at around 6, and the kitchen had been opened by the kitchen manager, who was putting around getting ready for the banquet later that day. I asked her if anyone had been on the back of the bar line that morning, and she said no, so I decided to go check it out quickly, and then got on with my day. I rounded the corner, and the pot was still on the hook. This was deeply disturbing to me, and I made every effort from that moment to never be on the bar line alone again. The second incident was enough to make me quit. We had a crazy day of prep ahead of us, as we had multiple functions that weekend, including our famous Sunday brunch in the Colorado Room. The head chef asked me to come in super early that Sunday so that we could be ready for the 2 parties and the brunch. I arrived around 4:30 in the morning, with reinforcements scheduled at 5:30, so I immediately went into arsehole and elbows mode, as I had a mountain of shit to get done. I was working on the main line, which faces the Colorado Room's main serving doors. However, the line itself faces back into the kitchen galley, so that puts your back to the dining room whilst working the line. I am deep into work mode when weird sounds start to penetrate my veil of concentration. It sort of sounds like kids playing in the dining room. My subconscious mind immediately discounts this as not my problem, and I don't even break my stride on the line. After a few moments, a niggling thought is itching my brain that just doesn't go away. I distinctly remember a feeling of wrongness slowly descend upon me, and then it hit me. What the hell are kids doing, playing in the Colorado Room at 4:30 in the morning? I immediately had that cold, icy feeling shoot up my spine, and then just out of the corner of my vision, I see the door to the Colorado Room swing open just a bit, and I begin to hear the unmistakable sound of a rubber ball bouncing into the kitchen. As I swing my gaze quickly to the left, I see a red rubber kickball, clear as day, rebound in the gallery, with the far-off sound of a child's laughter floating through the Colorado Room. I just froze. I have never been that freaked out in my entire life. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I stood there rooted to the spot. I must have stood stock still for a full minute, and then I heard the rear doors open and the sound of familiar voices. My reinforcements were there. I have never been more relieved to hear other people's voices than in that moment. The girl who was helping me that morning makes her way to the main line. She immediately stops in her tracks when she sees me, and I shit you not, she says, "You look like you've seen a ghost." I quickly retell the tale to her and the prep boy as we search the galley for the room, to no avail, and then turn the lights in the Colorado room to full blazing ass daylight, and go figure, no ghost children. I put my 2 weeks notice in the following day. The manager of the hotel asked me to sit down with him a few days later after I inquired about a reference. He had heard my tale and wanted to chat to me about it, and boy did he have a tale to tell. I thought that I had heard all of the tales associated with the alleged hauntings of the Hotel Colorado, but apparently she still keeps some secrets. It turns out that not long after the hotel opened, a little girl accidentally chased her rubber ball off a 5th floor balcony and fell to her death. She is frequently seen on the 5th floor in Victorian dress and has even reportedly played catch with some of the guests' children. Her red ball was famous amongst workers of the hotel in previous generations, and its ghostly appearance frequented the banquet rooms, and yes, the kitchens too. My grandmother is getting pretty old now, and she tells this story pretty often. In the 60s, she took her 3 young kids and left her abusive husband. The only house she could afford to rent at first was a ramshackle 4-room farmhouse in the middle of nowhere. It didn't even have indoor plumbing. It just had an outhouse and a well at the back where they drew water. According to her and my mother, every night at around 2 a.m, they would hear the back door in the kitchen unlock and open. It was an old door, and both these actions had very distinctive, unmistakable sounds. They would then hear heavy footsteps walking across the creaky kitchen floor to the water bucket, and the water dipper would rattle against the bucket like someone was dipping out a drink of water. And then nothing. It started to scare the shit out of her, of course. But once she ascertained that no one was breaking and entering, so there was no one to shoot, she settled down. In her eyes, whatever was happening isn't harmful. My mother, on the other hand, was the only kid old enough to really understand what was happening, and it freaked her out. So my grandmother decided to get her sister, my great aunt Sue, to stay over one night. They planned to sit up and see what the hell was going on. My mother was not going to join them at first, but she couldn't sleep and felt safer in the room with them, so she was there as well when 2 o'clock rolled around. They were sitting at the kitchen table drinking coffee when they heard the back door unlock and swing open. The thing is, they were staring straight at it, and it didn't move. Same with the footsteps and the water dipper. They saw nothing, even though they could hear it clearly, even discern the direction of the noises. That was pretty much that. It kept happening every night. They didn't stay in that house long because my grandmother found a job and a better rental closer to town, and my mother was super happy to get out of there. My grandmother still talks about it sometimes, and it's strangely hilarious because she's so unbothered by it. Because, I mean, I would pee my pants. But the last time I asked her why it didn't scare her, she just said, "Well, shit, he was just thirsty." This happened to my sister about 15 years ago, when she was in high school and I was in middle school. Our mother worked as a house cleaner and always became good friends for everyone whose home she cleaned. One of the homes was owned by an older couple that had no kids, but a huge house and a really nice pool that they always invited me and my siblings to go swimming in. The husband worked as the COO of a large airline company, and they lived in a really nice neighborhood on the largest lot with a forest of trees. When you were in their backyard, you couldn't see any other houses at all, just trees. It felt really secluded, almost spa-like, with a waterfall and a short iron fence, so you had a good view of the forest. Their house was really angular and architecturally interesting, with multiple levels made from walls of stone, even on the inside. Pretty much every room had a huge floor and ceiling window that looked out over the backyard and gave great views during the day. At night, however, the reflection from the inside light prevented you from seeing out, so it was always a little unnerving to walk by them, since you couldn't see what was outside. The couple also decorated with old Native American art and masks, which was a little creepy to a middle schooler, but the couple wasn't creepy, so I never got too scared. They had an older golden retriever dog named Samson that lived up to his name. He was massive, but had a sweet and gentle temper. They also recently rescued a husky mix named Sadie, who was quite the opposite. Psycho Sadie, as we lovingly called her, had an intense separation and stranger anxiety. She would destroy their house when they left her inside, jump the short fence if they left her outside, and if they took her with them to run errands, she would destroy the car and howl non-stop until they returned. So since they were wealthy and had the extra money, they would pay for me or my sister to go over and dog sit, whilst they went out. We got paid $20 an hour, and we would always be excited to go over there to watch cable and swim in their awesome pool. Normally everything would be fine, and both dogs would just lay around, but occasionally Sadie would realize I was a stranger and would go nuts and begin barking at me. One time, she backed me into a corner and would not stop barking until I watched her eyes literally turn red. I was convinced she was going to attack me, but she eventually calmed down after I got up on a couch and showed her how big I was. But I digress. This particular incident happened over Easter weekend, whilst the homeowners were out of town for 2 days. They were paying my sister to stay out there over the weekend, and I stayed with her the first night because it was a big house and kind of scary to stay there all alone, so we stayed up late watching chick flicks and eating junk. The next day, we swam in the pool and hung out, but for some reason I didn't spend the night again, and I'm so glad I didn't, because what happened scarred my sister for life. It all started when my sister was working out on their treadmill. Their workout room was on the bottom floor of their home, which was a walk-out basement. Just outside the room was a huge sliding glass door that opened their patio and pool. She had the TV on in their workout room, watching the 10 Commandments that is always on the night before Easter. As she was running, she thought she heard the house alarm beep, like it did whenever a door was opened. She stopped the treadmill and went to look around and saw that the sliding glass door was now open. Now this door is huge, and there's no way that it could have opened by itself, so she was instantly freaked. However, the dogs were just laying there in the workout room, and she figured that they would have gotten up to investigate if someone had come inside, since they have those kind of instincts. So she made the excuse that she accidentally left the door open, and she must have imagined the beep of the alarm, and it could have been the TV or the treadmill. She closed and locked the door and went back to working out, but a couple of minutes later, she had the distinct feeling that somebody was watching her. So she looked around but didn't see anyone. She finished her workout but couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She finished her workout but couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, so she decided to just go to bed because she was a little creeped out and she just wanted to forget about it. She went around and made sure all the doors were locked. The owners didn't give her the alarm codes, so she couldn't set it. She took a shower and locked herself in the guest room with both dogs, just in case, and eventually fell asleep. A couple of hours later, she awoke to both dogs growling at the door of the room. Now, it was fairly normal for Psycho Sadie to growl and bark for no reason, but Samson had never barked or shown any signs of aggressiveness. So immediately my sister knew something was up. She was shaking and trying to convince herself that the dogs had just heard an animal and that it was nothing. But then she heard that dreadful door alarm beep. She called my dad in a panic, crying and screaming, and he told her to hang up and call the police. While he was on his way, she called the cops, and my dad made the 15-minute drive in under 5. When she opened the bedroom door to let my dad in the house, the dogs took off running and barking through the house and downstairs to the basement. My sister ran screaming all the way through the house to the front door and let my dad in, and he took a quick look around the upstairs levels with his gun, but didn't see anything unusual. The police arrived a few minutes later and looked around and found that the back gate was open, as well as the sliding glass door again, but not enough to let the dogs out, just barely, like it had been slammed shut and bounced back open a little bit. They said it did look like someone had entered the home through the sliding glass door because the lock had been tampered with, but they determined that whoever it was hadn't stolen or disturbed anything. When my dad asked why someone would break in and not do anything, especially with dogs locked up, they said that they had been notified by the homeowners earlier that month that the husband had received a death threat because of some decisions that he made at his job that put a lot of people out of work. They had gone to the police about it, but didn't bother to tell my sister to keep an eye out for anything suspicious. Thanks a lot for the heads up. Needless to say, we never dog sat for them again, and they moved out of state within a few months because he lost his job and he deserved it. These stories were recounted to me by my grandmother whilst reminiscing about old memories, and the following accounts take place in the mid-1920s, when my grandmother was a young girl. About the age of 5 or 6, she started talking to an imaginary friend who she called Heather. My grandmother said that they would spend their days playing in the backyard and exploring the property behind the house, which was basically just a large woodland area, plus a small lake that was usually dried up in the warmer months. They never ventured into the woods. They kinda just hung around playing on the swing set and picking flowers. But my grandma said that Heather was always scared to go near the lake when it was full of water, and she never understood why. Heather would never tell her the reason why she got so afraid. As my grandmother got a little older, she said that she stopped seeing Heather around. No big deal to her, as they were other neighborhood kids to play with. But not long afterwards, a friend of my grandmother's stopped for a visit and brought with her some photos. My grandma hung around the two adults and looked at the pictures. Upon doing so, she comes across a photo of a little blonde girl with blonde pigtails and is dressed in the clothes that were popular for girls in the early 1900s. My grandma chirps in, "That's Heather." My grandma's mother's friend looks at the photo and asks how my grandma knew this little girl. "That's Heather. She was my friend, but I don't see her anymore and she went away." My grandma's friend then goes on to tell them that Heather was a little girl who had lived in the neighborhood a few years prior to my grandma and her moving in, and that Heather had drowned in the lake behind the house. As it turns out, Heather may have not been an imaginary friend after all. This story takes place around 1930. I'll preface by saying that my grandma says what takes place in this story is the reason why she's so afraid of looking out at windows at night. My grandmother, who's now divorced, worked as a maid for a very wealthy man in their town. Because she was divorced and didn't have enough money for her own house since she was supporting herself and a small child, the man offered them a room to stay in exchange for working for him, which makes him sound kind enough. But apparently he was very verbally abusive towards them, although they just took his abuse as being just how men of this time acted, and didn't think too much of his words. But after a while, his behavior did start to wear on them. So my grandmother began working towards saving up enough money so that they could leave and get a place of their own. She knew the man would be furious if he found out that she was trying to leave, as he had become very possessive of both of them. So one night, not long after my grandmother had earned enough money to leave, they quickly and quietly gathered up their things, which weren't much at the time, and my grandmother was quickly ushered towards the window by her mother. As my grandmother reached out to open the window, she let out a scream. Peering in through the pitch-black window was the face of the man, with a look of pure rage contorting on his face. He held up a large butcher knife and banged it against the window, yelling, "If you try and leave, I shall slit both of your throats." My grandma's memory of how the rest of the night played out was hazy, as it was such a long time ago, and it was such a traumatic event that she tried to forget. All she can remember is, she and her mother had to stay there a few more months before they attempted another escape, and this time, they were successful. This last story happened to my grandmother later in life, somewhere around the 70s, when my grandmother remarried after her first husband passed away. She and her second husband moved into a house that was something like 100 years old. Not long afterwards, my grandma reported being awoken every couple of nights or so by the sound of bagpipe music, which sounded like it was coming from their front room, which was just down the hallway from her bedroom. She rarely ever got up to investigate, and would just lie there in the darkness too frightened to move, and wouldn't be able to go back to sleep until the music had stopped. But one night, she got up to use the bathroom, leaving the lights off, and on her way back down to the hallway to her bedroom, she heard the bagpipe music playing. She stood frozen in the hallway when she saw a man standing in the front room, dressed in a kilt and everything, and playing the bagpipes. He was standing with his back to her, and she took the chance to run into her bedroom and slam the door. Now it all sounds very comical in a way, but my grandmother was petrified to actually be witnessing a ghost for the first time since childhood. As an aside, it's worth mentioning that this wasn't the only creepy thing that happened around this house. The next incident occurs a couple of years later. My grandmother's husband owned a caravan that he kept around the back and was filled with most of his stuff from his previous marriage that he just couldn't bear to get rid of. But my grandmother didn't want it in their house. Now, the two things in the caravan were a pair of marionette puppets that had belonged to his daughter from the previous marriage. His daughter had passed only years prior, and it was the only thing of hers that he had decided to keep, and he stored them in a caravan because they creeped my grandmother out, and with good reason. Now fast forward to the early 1980s, when my older brother was a little kid, and he would stay at my grandmother's house on occasion. His memory is also hazy on this. He did sleep in the caravan once, and was awoken in the middle of the night by a scratching and scraping sound. The noise stopped not long after he woke up, and since he was young, he shrugged it off and went back to sleep right away. But when he woke up in the morning, he found that the two marionette puppets that were in the room with him were in different positions than the previous night, like the head of one of them was facing a different direction than when he last saw it when he fell asleep, and the arm of the other was no longer by its side, but was up and pointing out of a window. My brother was scared, and he never slept in the caravan again. But my grandmother's husband spent a lot of time in there during the day, working, and there were many reports of him looking up every so often, and the position of the marionette having changed only a couple of minutes since the last time he had glanced at them. Even though he'd never heard a sound from them, he said he was oddly soothed by it, as he thought he could feel the presence of his daughter in the room with him, as he felt that she was still playing with the marionettes even after her death. I am definitely a people person, so it didn't take me long to work my way up the ladder at our hotel. I loved that hotel. It was really old, built in 1967, and despite the shambles it was in when I worked there, it used to be the most happening place in town. The decor was unlike a lot of hotels you see today. Elaborate chandeliers with imported Spanish tiles and beautiful handmade stained glass skylights. A lot of people were shocked that our rooms were only $50 a night, but it wasn't before long I realized that something was just off about that place. We had this service hallway that connected our kitchen and storage rooms to all of our conference rooms. It was my first day, and I'm taking a tour of the facilities with my manager whilst he's showing me around. I noticed how it smelt like a nursing home, like mothballs and death. And it was just unnaturally cold, especially for Louisiana in the spring. The deeper we go down the hallway, I started to actually feel sick. I put it off as my nerves, but whatever is in that kitchen/hallway scared the shit out of me a couple of weeks later. I was working the 3 to 11 PM shift. Around 8 or 9 PM, I went to find a guest some silverware from the kitchen. I was still pretty new there, so after searching for the light switch, I gave up and used my phone as a flashlight to grab the silverware. That's when I notice the sound of footsteps. Really fast footsteps. I start to turn around, and someone or something ran right past me in the dark, knocking over the stack of chafing dishes on the prep table. Needless to say, I said hell to the silverware and ran straight out of there. I ended up calling a housekeeper, who stayed in the hotel occasionally to grab it out of the kitchen, but she said no one was in there. No one working there wanted to go into that hallway. Even the cook would bring her granddaughter with her in the morning to keep her company while she got breakfast started. No one ever knew exactly what was back there, but I guess, then again, we just didn't want to find out. After that experience, I was sufficiently scared, but curious. I had become friends with our elderly breakfast cook, a little old woman probably in her 70s, Mrs. J. She mentioned to me that she'd been working there since the early 70s. She began telling me stories that made me never look at the hotel in the same way again. From what she told me, the owner was a cheap bastard, even when I worked there, and he didn't want to purchase actual security cameras for the entire property. So, he installed 2 actual cameras in the lobby, 1 at each entrance, and 1 by the pool, but placed mock cameras down the halls, giving the appearance of security, when actually they were just plastic boxes. Anyway, one night a young lady checked in, stinking drunk all by herself at 1 in the morning. She requested a smoking room, which are only located on the back of the property on the 2nd floor. This area also has one of the many blind spots from our cameras. She goes to her room, and no one hears from her from the rest of the night. Not unusual, it's a hotel. That is until the housekeepers show up in the morning to find the woman in the parking lot, covered in blood, whiskey, and bloated. Apparently, after she checked in, she continued her binge on the balcony, facing the parking lot. She must have fallen off and bled to death there. The horrifying part is that she must have still been alive after the fall, because of the trail of blood behind her, like she was trying to crawl for help. And because there were no cameras, the front desk was blissfully unaware. We always had problems in that wing of the hotel afterwards. Domestic violence cases always came out of that wing. People's tempers just seemed to skyrocket when they stayed over there. Another interesting story she told me, and I ended up experiencing. There was a country singer named Charlie Rich who died in one of our suites. Our suites were located inside the actual lobby, facing the front desk. He had a pulmonary embolism whilst his wife was eating breakfast in our restaurant. Mrs. J was even there when his wife found him dead. Room 208. Ever since, a lot of customers have complained of people knocking on their door at odd hours, but the front desk never saw anyone go into the room. One customer came running out in the middle of the night. He ran up to the night auditor and told him that there was a man in his room. Of course, when the night auditor went to investigate, there was no sign of an intruder. A lot of the time, when the room would stay vacant for a while, the TV would turn on by itself. I even saw through the open window. It just turned on, and always the same channel, CMT channel 71. Charlie never really bothered the staff. I even found myself talking to Charlie on our more quiet nights. Sometimes, I even played my old country playlist for him. I ended up quitting after working there for 5 years. The owner was doing some sketchy things with my paycheck, so I said my final farewell to the hotel that I had grown to love so much. Not even a year after I left, the owner suddenly shut down the hotel. Not sure why, but all the employees were told not to come back the next day, or ever. They left everything in there. All the papers, computers, furniture, food, all left inside the massively vacant blood-red building. Back in the mid-1960s, my grandfather was 18 at the time. His younger sister, her fiancé, and a friend we all call Mike, decided to mess with the Ouija board that Mike had gotten. According to my grandfather, no one believed in it. Even though my grandfather's family were quite religious, they didn't believe that a spirit nor demon could really manifest through a toy. They got to playing, asked it the usual stuff. We all know the drill. Suddenly, his sister asked, "When will I die?" And it spelled out, "Soon." My grandfather didn't think it was very funny that Mike was trying to scare her. His sister egged it on, asking for different details and specifics, until finally the board spelt out 19 and train. They all scoffed. There weren't any trains near their town, and they left their town maybe once a year. They call it quits and forget about it. Fast forward a few months, October 19th of that year, my grandfather's sister was surprised by a gift from her fiancé with a trip to a large nearby city to see a show. Later that night, the police informed my grandfather's family that there had been an accident. The fiancé had tried to beat the train because they couldn't wait a few minutes for the train to pass at the crossing, and it had been hit, killing both of them instantly. I found all of this out for the first time when I was 6, when I asked my grandfather if we could get a Ouija board like the one we saw on the paranormal/ghost show that we were watching. Obviously, he said no. I was a freshman in high school, staying at UC Berkeley for a summer academic program. I shared a dorm room with 2 other girls in an old building. There was a single bed on one side of the room, a tiny window, a desk in the middle, and a bunk bed on the other side. The 3 girls I roomed with were in different sections of the program, so we were never together. I had come into the room late, used my phone's light to set my shit down, turned it off, and quietly climbed into bed in the top bunk. I shut my eyes and fell asleep for what felt like an hour. I woke up to the girl on the other side of the room calling my name. I rolled over and hissed, "What?" Her voice shook as she said, "There's someone in here with us. I saw them come in and rummage through our things." I instantly went from sleepy to alert, but was still confused. The girl was saying things like, "Please don't hurt us, take whatever you want, just please leave us alone," over and over, whilst the intruder's response was silence. At this point, my heart is pounding, and I'm too scared to even look off the side of the bunk. The girl starts crying, and the roommate beneath me is now awake. My fight or flight is kicking in hard, so I slid between the wall and the bed down to the bunk beneath me. I had my phone, but I had no service. The other girl had no service. We tried frantically to see if we could look up a phone number for security, but we got nothing. The girl across the room is still begging and pleading with the intruder. I tell her to get her ass outside, so she sprints over to the desk and into our bunk. I grab her and say, "Where is he? Is he still in the closet?" She says she doesn't know, but she knows he's in there. I look around and it's too dark to tell. Fear is starting to take over, and I tell the girls that I'll run and turn on the light switch near our door. We outnumber him and take him on. They are too shaky to agree. I'm about to leave these girls because they're paralyzed with fear, and I tell them to run as I hold the door open and they can sprint out. It was like a movie because one of the girls goes, "No, I won't let that happen. If we run together." So we link arms and sprint to the door at full speed, make it down the hall, and barrel down to where the leader of the program slept. Security was called and the room was checked. No one was there. Maybe they escaped. We were all so shaken up that we ended up changing dorms. For a few years I thought that I had barely escaped death or rape, but eventually I came to the realization that none of it was real. The figure my roommate saw come into the room was me. She'd assumed I was already in the room sleeping. She didn't see me climb into bed because of the angle, and me shutting off my phone. The 3 of us thought we were going to die, and it was me. I laugh so hard when I think about it now, but for years, it was the creepiest experience of my lifetime. I was working in the 3rd largest building on the planet for floor space. It's about 3 AM on a Sunday, and I'm walking down an aisle in the middle of my department. At this time, the place was nearly vacant as it was a holiday weekend, and we only had myself and a crew of maintenance workers under my direction, working in another department, all of whom were males. As I'm walking by my office on the plant floor, the power goes out, and the plant drops into the most absolute darkness that I have ever experienced. Power gone, I hear the various machines spinning down to rest, and the silence becomes overwhelming relative to the background noise that I had gotten used to. The faint sounds of running water become evident in the moments after the blackout, while I began searching my pockets for my phone and the flashlight that it offered. As my hand found my phone, a scream erupted from somewhere nearby, muffled and distant. It was the kind of scream you hear from a 5-year-old girl in her first haunted house. as the bloody clown steps around the corner and fires up the chainsaw. It startled me so badly. I immediately dropped my phone into an alternate dimension. The scream continued, a constantly fading note that seemed to be moving away from my position. Panicked and terrified, I fumbled around the dirty floor for my phone and found it seconds before the emergency lights lit up the plant with an eerie glow of yellow light. Sweat beaded on my forehead as I looked about me, muscles tense and ready to defend against whatever this was. I tried my radio a couple of times before I realized that, with the power outage, the digital frequencies were useless without the receiver up in the main offices. I started to move through the various production lines towards where I assumed the scream had originated. Mind working furiously. I had no women in my crew tonight, and we were the only people allowed in the plant. So where had the scream come from? Details began to press in my mind that I hadn't noticed before. The apparent youth of the voice behind the scream made no sense. It was a scream of pain, the kind you cannot even attempt to control. It had faded away from my position gradually, and then trailed off, as if she had run out of breath. As I stepped between two products on one of the final assembly lines before a wide open space in the next department, the emergency lights dimmed, that audible electrical buzz filling the space around me. Struggling to understand what was happening, my senses were again knocked askew when the normal plant lights blazed to life, leaving spots across my vision for a moment, forcing me to raise my hand and shield my eyes. As the shadow crossed my vision, I saw it, or rather I saw her. Only for that moment, she stood there, hands outstretched towards me, a vague outline partially hidden behind one of our products. Dark features were the only distinguishable characteristic I can remember, as my reflex in that moment had been to blink against the bright lights, and she was gone after that. To this day, I have no idea if what I saw was real or if I had imagined it. No tales are told of the mysterious young woman in the repair hole, not by anyone but myself. No one knows of any deaths matching to her description in the area, or ghosts known to haunt the plant. Not a soul had heard a scream in the darkness, not before, during, or after those black pre-dawn minutes. Believe me, I tried to find someone, anyone with information that might explain what I saw, to no avail. I am left wondering, with a memory more crisp than any photo I've seen, of that young woman standing there in the distance, her arm outstretched towards me. Needless to say, I did not revisit the location of said event, ever, because nopes don't get any bigger than that. This happened to my father when he was in his early 20s. He is from a small town in Mexico, and he and his cousin walked to a town about 5 miles away. Well, once in the neighbouring town, they made their way to the local watering hole. They were having such a good old time they didn't realise it was so late. So they're ready to leave, but by this point it's 11 PM. Dreading the long walk back, they see a horse that is tied to a tree. "Look, we have a taxi," my father says. Both of them get on the bareback horse, with my dad's cousin in the front and my dad in the back. My dad and his cousin are euphoric. They are singing and are just giddy that they have found a horse to ride. They figure that once they get to their town, they'll just shoo the horse away and it will find its way back to its owner. So they are having the time of their lives, when all of a sudden, just out of nowhere, this huge dog runs up to them. It is growling and barking, and the worst part is it's trying to knock both my dad and his cousin off the horse. Then it goes back to try and bite them. All the while the horse is spooked and is just jumping up on its legs. Well, in those days, everybody carried a handgun. My dad and his cousin were no different, probably dealing with a rabid dog. So my dad takes out his gun and point blank shoots the dog in the head. At this point, my dad knew that he hit the dog, as he saw it hit its head. But the dog just shook it off and continued to lunge at them. At this point, my father is asking, well, it's a rabid dog, so I must shoot it until he possibly can't get up anymore. So he empties his 6-shooter into the dog. Same thing, the dog just shakes it off. Then my dad unholsters his cousin's gun and fires all the bullets into the dog. Same thing, the dog becomes even more vicious. At this point, my dad says he felt the biggest chill he's ever felt surge through his body. They take off on the horse while the dog was chasing them, but finally they see that the dog is being outrun and is staying further and further back. Once they reach the entrance of our village, there is no sign of the dog, so they dismount and shoo the horse back. They both run to their houses, having sobered up pretty quickly, and the next day they both decide to check the area where the dog appeared, and they couldn't find a trace of blood whatsoever. I worked overnight security in one of the largest, best, and oldest hospitals in the US. My fellow security officers and I all have stories about one building in particular, but the one that I'll tell is the one that happened to me. Backstory for the building. It was built in the late 1800s, and it was originally the psychiatric building for the hospital. Now, being the late 1800s, not much was truly known about psychiatric disorders, and on top of that, this hospital was known for its medical research. With both those facts combined, you can infer that some terrible shit was done to these misunderstood psych patients in the building. A couple years before I started working security there, this building had been converted into offices after the newly built part of the hospital dedicated a section for an updated psych ward. So, my rounds for the night happened to include said building. At night, this building was empty due to recently being converted into offices, and the drones who worked there wanting to leave promptly at 5, if not earlier. In some of their haste, they had left the office doors unlocked, which is a big no-no due to medical information being located in their offices. It was our duty to go to each and every floor and make sure every door was locked, and if it wasn't, to secure it ourselves. I did my initial sweep of the building to make sure it was clear, and proceeded to do my door-to-door checks. The hallways were pretty narrow, so I could check both sides of the hallway doors at once. At the end of this hall, there were 2 sets of doors you had to go through to reach the final office, which was a dead end. Everything was secure, awesome, time for the next floor. I exited the 2 sets of doors from the dead-end office and stood absolutely frozen from what I saw. Every door ajar, set perfectly so their own weight wouldn't cause them to shut again, and one wheelchair at the end of the hallway, facing towards the steps. I had heard other security officers outright reject that set of rounds due to the strange stuff happening there, but I laughed it off until that night, and I never took those rounds again. I haven't thought about this story in years, but I want to share it now. I was around 10 or 11 at the time. I was in the church softball league, and we had a game this day. I was about 3 people away from being up at bat, so I was standing outside a bit down the third baseline, taking some practice swings. This older guy comes up to me, and he starts chatting, asking about the game, and what league we were, pretty mundane stuff. He goes on to tell me that he was looking for some help. He said he'd accidentally locked his keys in his truck, and he was worried because his dog was in there and it was a hot day. His truck, however, had one of those small windows at the back of the cab that was too small to fit through, but it would be no problem for a child, and maybe I could do him a huge favour and help him out really quick. Now I know what you're thinking. How could you not realise this was really sketchy? Or didn't your parents ever tell you not to talk to strangers? Well, yes, they did. But I was 11 and in broad daylight, surrounded by the people I knew. It just didn't really ring any alarm bells. It haunts me to this day how close I was to saying yes. The only thing that saved me was the fact that the person at back got a hit, putting me within 2 batters, aka in the hole. I told the man that I was almost up to bat, but I'm sure that he'd find someone to help him. After the game, I nonchalantly mentioned it to my parents. They get very serious and begin asking me all kinds of questions. What did he look like? What was he wearing? Which direction did he come from? Etc. My dad picked up his phone and made a call. I was of course scolded, but the gravity of it never hit home. I'm 26 now, but a few years ago that incident came up. Turns out my parents kept an eye out in the news, and lo and behold, a guy matching the description I gave was arrested in the same area for attempted kidnapping not too long after. I grew up in rural Ireland. My dad was 18 when his father, my grandfather, got ill and became bedbound. One evening, my dad was sitting with his father, talking about various jobs that he needed to do on the farm. After talking for a while, my grandfather asked him if he wouldn't mind going out to the dairy, or the milking parlour, to get a bottle of whiskey that he kept out there, probably to hide it from my grandmother, who was a bit too generous with the whiskey when guests came. My father went out to the dairy and was looking for the whiskey. The dairy had one of those little windows on the back that looked out into the farm. On the other side of the window was a pit, where all the cow shit from the winter was kept. If you stood in it, you would sink immediately and suffocate and die, in the most horrific way imaginable, literally drowning in shit. But that aside, my father was looking for the whiskey, and then he heard 3 solid knocks on the window. Knocks heavy enough to break the window. He stood on the spot because he knew that there was no way anyone could knock on that window, as it was the window facing the pile of shit, with 0 access from the other side. After a few moments he snapped out of it and realised what he had heard. Death knocks from the banshee. It was a sign that someone close to you would die, and he immediately ran back into the house and up to his father. He found his father dead, with his 2 hands together as if he were praying. My father believes that if his father knew what was happening, he didn't want him in the room to experience it. My dad said he had been in a lot of pain that day, and he never did find that bottle of whiskey. At the end of last year, I had to move back in with my mum due to the breakdown of my marriage. My mum lives in a house which was built in the late 1900s, and a lot of surrounding houses have been rebuilt over the years due to bomb damage in World War II. It was probably the hardest time of my life, as I was adjusting to being newly single, a recovering alcoholic, and a single mum, and keeping my full-time job as a funeral director. Strangely enough, I could comfortably stay late at my work, on my own, in the cold room, presenting people in their coffins on my own. However, I would dread going home to my mum's house. The atmosphere was just off. My mum had often spoken of her house being haunted by a lady who she called Mary, and had claimed that she woke up one Christmas Eve with the lady, in a 40s style tea room dress, standing in her room, looking out of her window. We had been there that night, when my ex-husband and I were still together, and filmed our little boy wandering around upstairs, with inexplicable lights following him around. The stairs led to 2 rooms, the one on the left, which was my mother's, and the one on the right, which was the spare bedroom. The bathroom was downstairs, attached to the kitchen. My mother has always been a bit of a drama queen, so we brushed it off. However, once I moved in with her, she went to work. She worked night shifts as a nurse, leaving me alone in the house. And that's when I started to notice things. I would wake up at 3 a.m, with my bedroom door slamming open, hear people walking around downstairs, and the cupboard under the stairs would open its doors randomly, and I could hear my son's toys going off. Despite spending 90% of my time around dead people, I felt petrified. The atmosphere was all wrong, so I did what any 25-year-old would do and hid under my duvet until my mum got home at 7 a.m. A couple of weeks later, I was sitting on my bed chatting up people on Tinder when something hit me and fell onto the bare floorboards by my bed. It was one of my knitting needles, which had been embedded in a ball of wool across the room. I haven't really got a rational explanation as to how it could have got there. In January, I took an overdose in the spare room. I had lost my job that day, and it was the straw that broke the camel's back. I took 360 Tamidrol, with some other meds and a litre of vodka. Obviously, I ended up surviving, but had done quite some damage to my body. I sat in the lounge trying to read a book, when I saw someone prep around the doorframe from a height. The stairs are right behind the doorframe, so it was as though someone was stood on the stairs, peering round. My mum was sleeping off her shift at the time, and her bed is noisy, so I knew it wasn't her, and this person, or Mary, was unnaturally white. I moved out into my own flat in April, and really couldn't wait to see the back of my mum's house. Just too many horrible memories, and the overwhelming feeling that I wasn't wanted there. My nana had bought me some pots and pans so that I could cook at mine, and she'd left them in my mum's dining room on the table. I picked them up on my way through town, and discovered that my mum had moved in the grandfather clock which her grandfather had made, as my nana gave it to her with the promise that she'd fix the mechanism, which made a bong sound every 15 minutes. As I picked up my pans, the clock bonged really loudly, and I scuttled out. I told Mum later that the clock looked great, although it was a bit creepy in her house with all the noise it made. That's when she told me it didn't have the weights or pendulum, so it would have been impossible to make a noise. My nana and uncle have both stayed at my mum's house and have had very similar experiences. I tried to stay away because, although I don't think there's anything harmful there, it makes me feel unsettled staying there for any length of time. I was in college in 2009, and I used to drive a little manual 2-door car. I was walking out of a big box store one night, and there's this disheveled woman in hysterics outside. She's claiming her boyfriend took her paycheck to go get high, and now she can't get home. Well, where's home? I ask. She answered that it's in a town that was probably 20 minutes away. But for me, it wasn't that far out of my way to help the random crying lady. During the car ride, she acts more and more fidgety, and tells me her history of drug abuse and her abusive druggy boyfriend, and how she probably won't be able to pay rent and everything like that. Meanwhile, we're driving out to the more secluded parts of town, and the drive is taking longer and longer. About halfway through the drive, she mentions that she has a host of mental illnesses, schizophrenia, bipolar, etc. And now, I'm beginning to wonder about the truth of her story. But whatever. That explains the fidgeting, especially if she's just finished with her panic attack. Finally, after 45 minutes of driving, we reach a house with no lights and no cars there. She told me she lived there with her kids and her mum, and she starts to fumble around to hand me money for gas. I told her not to worry about it, because my mileage is fine and she needs to pay the rent. She hesitated then, and I'm not sure if she hesitated because I was not accepting the money, or because she was thinking of doing something else. But I was in the middle of nowhere, near an empty house. I turned on my GPS, with directions to home, to indicate that I was leaving. Pretty quickly she got out the car, went into a completely different direction away from the empty house, and into the woods. I never saw her again, and I'm not sure if she was just scared, or if she was trying to lure me out to the middle of nowhere for whatever reason. A part of me hopes she really was just coming down after a panic attack, and got left in the parking lot by her abusive druggy boyfriend. And she was just jittery because it was all happening to her there and then. I definitely started getting freaky, that something was not quite right. I've thought about it before, and thinking that if it was Jubia, something must have changed her mind. I grew up in the same house as my grandmother. Actually, the same one that my grandfather lived in and died in. It's a big farmhouse, and my grandmother had her own living room/kitchen. The older my grandmother got, the meaner and grumpier she got. She wasn't the nicest person to be around, but she had a soft spot for me. She used to tell me I was going to be a priest. Ha, that would have been a dream for her. Her living room was by the stairs, and any time she heard my footsteps, as she could tell who was going up and down the stairs by their footsteps, she would call me into doing something for her or just to chit-chat. I enjoyed it, so I would always be happy to call in. She always got out of bed around 6 AM, and when she got older, she would call me in the mornings to make her a cup of tea, which I always did before going to school. She called me by my full name, Thomas, even though everyone, including my parents, called me Tom. When I was 18 though, my grandmother passed away. She was in her 80s and died in her sleep. The funeral was huge, and she got a good send-off. 2 days after the funeral, everyone in my family was going back to work. That morning, only my mum and I were left in the house. I was making a cup of tea, and out of nowhere I heard, "Thomas! Thomas!" I honestly thought I was going mad. I turned to my mother, who was sitting at the kitchen table, and her face was white. She had heard it too. I was freaked out by this, but my mum, being a religious woman, calmed me down and told me that it was her only wanting to say goodbye. My mother claims to have heard it a few weeks later when I left the house to go to university. I worked at a hospital, doing transport for a couple of years. The transport home base was in the basement of the hospital, where all the laundry is done, and supplies are also stored there. I hated working late nights after this incident. On this particular night, I was the only one in the basement, when I heard whistling at the end of the hallway by the elevator. I poked my head around the corner, expecting to see my only co-worker on duty that night, but there was absolutely no one there. I shrugged it off. I'm not easily spooked. Nights are slow, so I ate some snacks and hung out in the break room for a bit. Next thing I know, I hear a loud bang. I walked into the hallway, and a bed is rolling down the halls, bumping into the sides. At this point, I think my co-worker is bullshitting me, so I radio him, and he says he's upstairs in the cafeteria. I still don't believe him, and think I'll catch him in the act. I walk past the laundry room, and the machines start.
I pop my head in, expecting to find him there, but it's completely empty. Okay, starting to get a little nervous, I walked into the laundry room, and the machines completely stopped. I freeze, then run out and head towards the elevator, and I hear the whistling again. At this point, I know I am the only worker in the basement. As I am standing there waiting for the elevator, things start falling off the shelf down the hall. Boxes of gloves, tissues, packages of tubes. I am literally standing there, watching them fall off one by one at the opposite end of the hallway. I shit you not, my entire body broke out in goosebumps. My hair stood on the end, and I had a strong gut feeling I was being watched. I was not alone. As I was getting into the elevator, I feel what felt like someone brushing my arm. I went upstairs and found my co-worker in the cafeteria and freaked out to him. I got out of there and transferred soon after that. The creepy thing to add is that I usually whistle mindlessly to myself at work. It's almost as if the spirit was mimicking me. Creepiest feeling ever.
Hey guys, it's Mort here and thank you so much for listening. I hope that you enjoyed today's compilation in the snow. I've been researching and preparing for a very special episode tomorrow, a topic I'm sure you'll all really enjoy. Take your guesses in the comments section, and I'll confirm the first one to get it right. Also, my brother just released a new historical video on Alfred the Great. It's a really interesting listen, especially if you're into history or Vikings. I'll leave it on screen now for you to check out. It's an awesome video, and not to be missed. But anyway, for now guys, I'm gonna sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.